Hi, I'm Megan Finnerty of USA Today, the founder and director of the Storytellers Project, and I'm here with Mizell Stewart. He's the head of news, talent, and partnerships at the USA Today network. Hi, Mizell. We so appreciate you taking a chance on live storytelling this evening. Tonight, as part of USA Today Network's coverage of Black Americans' ongoing work for equity, we bring you Uprisings, stories of the work for civil rights. Amid hurt, protests, and anger over the police killings of unarmed Black Americans, our Storytellers team has put together a show we hope offers leadership, context, and comfort. Since 2016, the Storytellers Project has brought more than 100 shows to communities across the country, but because of the pandemic, it feels unsafe to be together in theaters, and yet feels necessary to be together online.
Now let's welcome our Storytellers. Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. Ashley Woodard Henderson, Co-Executive Director of the Highlander Research and Education Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. Joan Trumphauer Mulholland, an activist and former freedom rider. Judy Richardson, a former member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a documentary filmmaker whose credits include the Eyes on the Prize series on PBS. And April Ryan, White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Network, as well as an author and CNN commentator. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thanks.
Tonight is not a TED Talk. It's not a Toastmasters. It's not a how-to, an inspirational speech, and we promise you it will not be a lecture. Instead, it's storytelling, which is predicated on visiting, and you know how to visit. You open your heart to receive people who you're curious about, who you want to become closer to, and we truly invite you to do that here tonight. Some of these stories are going to be polished and professional, and some are going to be more casual and conversational. We ask you to receive all of them in the spirit in which they're intended, because we know that is how community change and community connection truly happens. No?
As protests over police killings of unarmed Black people sweep across America, we seek to respond to the scenes of anger and pain as recently as last night and today by creating a climate of understanding and empathy. Tonight's storytelling event lifts up true first-person stories from key figures in the struggle for Black civil rights, both then and now. We invite you to join us for a night of stories of hard truths, hopeful outcomes, and a fervent desire to build a more just nation. We believe America will never live up to its founding ideals unless we listen to and seek to understand people whose experiences are much different from our own, especially in times of uncertainty. With that, it is my honor to welcome Ashley Woodard Henderson to share how Appalachia influenced her life of advocacy.
Thank you, Mizell. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. As I get started, for all of the folks that are angry and disappointed tonight, for all of the folks that are brokenhearted but determined to defend democracy and build a country where all people are free, I see you. I love you. For Louisville, for the movement for Black Lives, for country kids, for Appalachia, for the Southern Freedom Movement, Black Lives Matter. Abolish the police department that murdered Breonna Taylor. You might be proud about where you're from, and I am too. I'm proud to have been born in the scenic city and raised off of Old Lee Highway and School Street. I am proud to be from the sticks, to be the 5th generation raised in Summit, Tennessee, in East Tennessee, in Appalachia, in the South, which is the largest geographic region in the United States. But when you think of people from Appalachia, this region within a region, you might think of hikers on the Appalachian Trail. You might think of banjo playing, cash poor white people. You know, people who are wealthy in values and culture and relationships, but are marginalized because they don't have money. But tonight, I'm here to introduce you to me and to tell you how my home shaped me and what I do. And likely, that will cause you to think differently about where you're from and how it shaped you and what you do. My house was a gray cinder block shack with a tin roof. My parents, like a lot of us, were some of the first people to invest in giving me an identity. I was raised learning about place and identity from my mother's parents, and that for 100 years or more had been raised in the same neighborhood with the same folks. From a church family who taught me to question everything, and that a theology not rooted in liberation for all people wasn't a theology worth having in the first place. My mom, a country girl who became a revolutionary, literally, my mom's a member of the Black Panther Party. My dad, a city boy from Memphis who had become a darling of the Black communications and arts movements in Chattanooga and put his whole life on the line by naming police officers who killed a Black man named Wadey Settles live on his radio show in 1982. I was born in 1985. So I was born into a family who had dedicated their lives to the work of collective liberation. I was born at the intersection of the urban-rural divide. We always ate, even if it was stuff that we picked out of the woods or our grandparents' gardens. And even when we didn't have a place to sleep other than our car, we always went to school, we always went to church. I always knew that we were loved. I didn't know that I was poor or expected to be less intelligent and less deserving until I attended predominantly white schools with class-privileged students whose educational needs and access to external opportunities were clearly different than what I was seeing being offered to the kids from my neighborhood. I only got a sneak peek by being the only Black kid in my gifted classes. The small number of Black kids and poor white kids who were not being tracked to attend Ivy League schools, those folks weren't being offered the same opportunities and access. It became clear liberty and justice and equality for all was not the priority for all of us. I'd never seen it more clearly, that there was a real discomfort with having real conversations about the histories we carry because of where we are born, in the South, in Appalachia. If anything, there was an avoidance of conversations at all costs about race and class, jokes about our accents, distancing ourselves from the complicated histories of the places that we're all from. White kids that never identified as being Appalachian and made fun of for fitting the stereotypes about our home. The myth that Black Appalachians don't exist in the first place. I was a kid internalizing all the overt and covert messages about what this place is and who my people are and what that meant in regards to who I was supposed to be. But this was only my first taste of how ideas I didn't even know existed were impacting my life. My mom and dad knew and worked with so many incredible people, Black Panthers and internationally respected activists, organizers, and artists. My mom attended the National Women's Political Caucus in 1991 and hung out with the likes of Tommy F. Brown, the first Black woman elected as state representative of the great 28th Legislative District of Tennessee. Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman elected to the US Congress and the first woman to run for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. And Ann Richards, the second woman to serve as governor of Texas. One of my parents' friends, a brilliant man from Chattanooga named Mukasa Ricks, coined the term Black Power. As I got older, I wanted to get involved in work that made a difference. I was so excited about being able to vote for the first time. My mom's dad had been a precinct chair all of my life, and I'd been filling out the little bubbles on my mom and grandmother's ballots for as long as I could hold a pen. In 2004, I realized that white class privileged students at my school were being targeted to register to vote, but the Black working class kids, including myself, were not. I called a man named Johnny Holloway, an elder Black organizer, the president of the Operation Push Coalition in my city. He taught me about 3 civil rights workers. Their names were James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, who were murdered in Neshoba County, Mississippi in 1964 for daring to fight for the right of Black people to vote. He told me about James Chaney's younger brother, Benjamin Chaney, who just so happened to be planning a reenactment of the Freedom Rides and was looking for young people that would live into his brother's legacy, doing voter registration and education work and fighting for justice in cold civil rights martyrs cases across the country. Johnny told me that if I planned the Chattanooga stop, he'd send me on the ride for free. Our stop in Chattanooga was magnificent, y'all. We barbecued, we sang, we danced. Our team registered over 500 people. I turned 19 on this trip, riding on a Greyhound bus with no air conditioner, with a handful of other young people who became my lifelong chosen family, educating people about why voting matters. We registered the most voters in my city. I met veterans of the civil rights movement. And when they found out I was born and raised in Tennessee, they asked if I knew about a place called the Highlander Center or the Highlander Folk School. They told me their stories of being there with white people, talking about how to build a world beyond segregation and racism. I knew I had to see it for myself. I drove up to see the 187-acre farm in the foothills of the Smokies for the first time in 2007. Hundreds of people from all walks of life were there. I got invited to come back to a workshop called Transitions by a person named Melandria Williams, where I met young white folks and Black elders from the mountains, folks who had grown up learning about their identity as Appalachians and Afro-Latins. They taught me about extractive industries like the mines that exploited the labor of cash-poor miners, folks that struggled financially because corporate CEOs hoarded profits earned by working people, and about the history of Black-led, multiracial, working-class movements for justice. I learned that those fights for justice were my inheritance. I learned that the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, was an Appalachian. The Empress of the Blues, Bessie Smith, an Appalachian. Nikki Giovanni, the activist and great poet, an Appalachian, and so many others. I started to question why the myths of monolithic whiteness and poverty were the stories that were being told about the folks where I'm from. I became thirsty for more of the real truth about Appalachia and the South. Organizing in every Southern state around a multitude of issues that everyday people were facing in their hollers and their hoods. I learned from names you might recognize, like Diane Nash, and from names you wouldn't, like Margaret Block. I organized campus workers into the only union for higher education employees in the state of Tennessee. I traveled the US and the global South, supporting work of all kinds: reproductive justice, environmental justice, racial justice, spending time in communities accompanying them as they fought for themselves, meeting incredible leaders along the way. In December of 2014, on the heels of the murder of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson, Missouri, I got a text from one of those leaders. Her name's Alicia Garza. You might know her as one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. She asked me if I would fly to New York City the next day. So I rode to the airport, got in a cab, rode to the Black Alliance for Just Immigration office, and the room was full of folks, some of whom I'd known for years, and some of who I recognized from other parts of the country who were fighting in defense of Black lives. I asked, what are the impossible things that we could only win if we work together? I asked, what could we do that could save Black people in our lifetime? And the answer was the birth of the movement for Black lives. And now, 6 years later, we've built trust, we've built relationship, we've built shared work, and we are leading the largest social movement in US history. This summer, we are seeing Black folks in the South and Appalachia getting together and speaking out for themselves. Shout out to the comrades in Louisville. We're seeing people fight for healthcare for all across the South, defending Black lives and rising against police violence. Right now, right here, I am certain that we are the manifestation of our ancestors' wildest dreams, y'all. I telling you my story, decoding the South and Appalachia through story, the first Black woman executive director of the historic Highlander Research and Education Center that I learned about on those freedom rides in 2004. A leader in the leaderful movement for Black lives, fighting for the Breathe Act. I'm in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, doing exactly what I was taught to do by the folks who taught me who I am because of where I'm from. Honoring those who taught me, earning the respect of the folks that will come after me, reminding the young ones in my life that they have plenty to be proud of and responsible to, that they, like me, regular working class kids, can make a difference in this world, and we have to. That right now we are making impossible things possible so that all of our people can live long lives in dignity, free from shame about where they're from, full of pride because we're from a place and a people worth loving. I am here today, born with a purpose, an investment by all these people who loved me, who taught me that everything I have is not of my own goodwill, it's my inheritance, the wisdom and the love and the faith of my people. It's always been the place and the people, y'all, the heart of Appalachia. Now you know a little bit more about my home place and about how it shaped me. And we're all a step closer to dismantling the myths of Appalachia, decoding the South, demystifying who leads the movement for Black lives because of this story. Now spread the story. Tell me who you are and how where you are from has shaped you too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I'm obviously incredibly moved. I so appreciate you reflecting on your mentors and the place you're from and what you know and what you do. Thank you so much for your story tonight.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you. It's so important to reflect on who poured themselves into us so that we can lead and we can give ourselves to others. Take a little breath. With that, our next storyteller is Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. He has words on the power of this moment in our time. He was with us earlier this morning and taped his story ahead, and he now will share it with you.
Thank you, Megan. As an African-American male in this country, we become keenly aware of the social construct of race. I can recall growing up in Detroit in middle school and watching a PBS special that was just released called Eyes on the Prize. And sitting there watching this storyline, and it was a 5-part series, if I can recall, and it had the images of people demonstrating, black and white footage. And this particular scene caught my attention. It was a very young boy, he was probably my age or younger, in the midst of the demonstration, or he could have been innocently there. And the police at the time had dogs attacking him, and he was crawling back. And it went from there to another storyline of the fire hose, and the high pressure of the fire hose pushing people against the wall. And the storyline went on. It's an important history, but for me at that time, I became so enraged watching those images, understanding that these individuals were simply trying to march for freedom. And that's what all the signs said, marching peaceful, march for freedom. And out of nowhere, I was standing up on the couch, punching air, just enraged, fury, in fear. It was fascinating now that I think about it. And so when the Breonna Taylor decision came down, I was doing an interview, and the reporter asked me, "How do you feel in hearing it?" And I said, for far too many of us, we have low expectation that the justice system will be just for us and or our community. And the disappointing decision of the grand jury not to charge a single officer for the murder of Breonna Taylor, but only to charge one officer for shooting and the bullet lodging through a neighbor's apartment. I didn't get as enraged as I did the day I was on that couch in the living room, but it's a constant reminder that the system of justice is not always just for African Americans. And matriculating through high school and finding myself in college in Mississippi and HBCU, Tougaloo College, and turning on the screen one evening only to see the evening news report of a Black man being beat by multiple police officers with batons. He wasn't resisting, he was just curled up, and it was the Rodney King incident. And I can recall watching that image and reacting the very same way I did when I was in middle school, punching air, just frustrated of this unfortunate reality that there is no compassion, no empathy for Black people as human beings in this country for far too many individuals. It also takes me to the time that I was driving my first car, and in a 7-day period that week, I was pulled over every day by the same two officers, and they performed the same routine of checking the car as if I was a drug dealer. Now, what was unique about this car? It was a beat up old car. Had a floor. I had a hole in the floor. And one of the times they pulled me over, my friend, we had just graduated from high school. He was in the police academy, and he was like, "Officer, I'm in the police academy," and they pat him down, and he was just issued a service revolver, and there was immediate reaction. Said, "I'm in the police academy," and they looked at the badge and they gave it back to him. No explanation. They went away. And that last day when they went to pull me over, and I was pulled up in front of my house, and my mother was like, "What are you pulling him over for him now? You've done this all week." Only to fast forward, after the Rodney King incident, there was a young man on my street on 23rd and Warren by the name of Malice Green, who had been beat by these same two officers. The level of expectation of a justice system that truly provides justice for African Americans is an unfortunate narrative that spans decades. It's a narrative that requires more of us to do things that are necessary to ensure that equal protection under the law is afforded to everyone. Whether it's the 4 little girls that are being bombed in Birmingham, and that this who would think that someone would bomb a church and you have 4 girls in there, choir rehearsal, Sunday school, Bible study, whatever the case may be. Or Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Ruth, and he massacre individuals who are there for Bible study. To get arrested and the law enforcement officers treat him with more dignity than individuals who have been murdered and committed no crime, and they took him to a Burger King so he can have a meal before they take him into custody. It's a level of reality that far too many individuals have to live with, but it's a responsibility in this moment to change that narrative. In this moment, create a new value proposition that's inclusive of all of the citizens of this country, not just some. The social construct of race had an impact on this nation's psyche in a way in which far too many people are being impeded to really accomplish their true potential. And how that feels to me personally is something that oftentimes I would find myself punching air because now I have children. And I pray that they will have children. And at some point, we have to break this cycle of this value proposition that if you are born in this nation and you are African American or you are seen as other, that your life is irrelevant. It simply don't matter. The factual statement that Black Lives Matter is not a statement to exclude anyone. It's a factual statement because far too many individuals who have been charged with the responsibility to protect and serve, far too many individuals who get elected to office to design public policy to impact all of us, disregard that our lives also have value and it matters. It's an opportunity for this nation to finally come to terms with the value proposition. Race is a social construct if you really think about the history of this nation, because in the 1900s and 1920s, if you was Irish in Boston or in the New England states, you were not considered white. If you was Jewish in the same period of time in many parts of this country, you were not considered white. Race is such a social construct that it's a political calculation or who would be accepted into this quote white caste system based on the need to maintain power, domination, and control. And at some point, we must break the caste system. We as a nation could never really achieve our full potential if we suffocate the opportunities of a large set of individuals. How that feel to me is a feeling that propels me to do the work that I have been doing and recognize that the work of freedom for all citizens is a continuum. It is that compelling, that motivating factor to say, if we lack the integrity, the ability, the empathy to truly hold the constitutional principles that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, a social contract that should be afforded to all citizens, a social contract that would treat non-citizens with respect and dignity. It is something that compels me to do the work that I do. It's something that compels me to question those who react in such a visceral response as if we are equated to Klansmen who seek to maintain a social construct that oftentimes demean them as individuals, but use them as puppets in a larger game. Working poor whites are victims of the same system. Middle income whites are victims of the same system. It is a system that we must abolish in this moment by moving people from the peaceful protest in the streets, which is very necessary to bring attention to social justice. If there were no peaceful protests in the streets, many of us would have never heard the name Breonna Taylor. If there were no peaceful protests in the streets, many of us would not have known the name of John Lewis, an ordinary individual who did some extraordinary things. And that's why I do what I do, because of standing up on that couch in middle school, punching air, because I seen the injustice that was being done, not to adults. Here was a little boy where the police was seeking an attack dog on. A little girl that was simply being placed in a school to integrate schools, and a violent mob yelling profusely to this child who was no more than the 5th, 6th, or 7th grade. This moment caused us to do something different. But it's because of moments like these that have led me to do the work that I have done, and I've spent my life working towards equal protection under the law and a level of equality that we strive for. We are at an inflection point. We must decide, are we going to move to the future for prosperous opportunity where our elderlies are treated with care and dignity, that our young people are provided a quality education, not the political hurdles that we currently see where young people born in a certain zip code are denied a full opportunity? And will we do away with this social construct and provide equal protection under the law and protect the rights of those who are disadvantaged, however we define disadvantage. Thank you.
Derek, thank you so very much for sharing your model of leadership and community-focused service. Your commitment to the safety, the equality, and opportunity for Black Americans is truly inspiring. USA Today and the USA Today network of more than 260 newsrooms across the nation are committed to covering all of America. We are taking proactive steps to ensure that the makeup of our newsrooms and our news report fully reflects the diversity of the communities we serve. We are doing so through a concerted effort to hire more journalists of color and by seeking out the stories of those who have consistently been underrepresented in mainstream media. Throughout the summer, our journalists have been on the front lines of protest marches and acts of civil disobedience, all aimed at moving our nation forward on issues of racial inequality and injustice. We share that commitment to build a better America. You can learn more about that commitment and view much of this summer's news coverage at www.usatoday.com/take action. And now, Megan, let me turn it over to you to introduce our next storyteller.
Thanks, Mizell, and thanks for repping the brand. Well, it's true, we're very proud of our colleagues. They work incredibly hard. Our next storyteller, who we're so pleased, is also one of our sisters in the media. April Ryan is here to talk about her responsibility covering the White House and some of the people who got her there. April?
Thanks, Megan. Well, I'm 5 generations removed from slavery. My great-great-grandfather, Joseph Dollar Brown, was sold on the auction block in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He moved to Chadbourn, North Carolina, with his wife, Laura, and the Brown family that brought him on that auction block in Fayetteville. Yes, he was enslaved, but Laura and Joseph Dollar Brown's children were free. I am a descendant of Joseph Dollar Brown and those children that he had with Laura Brown. The children, the names. He had a host of children, boys and girls, with Laura. And from that union, there was a child named Ida. Ida was my great-grandmother. She had a child, 2 children from a union, a marriage. That union produced a young girl named Etta Viola. Etta Viola was my grandmother. And in her union of marriage, she had 14 children. And one of those little girls that she had was my mother, Mary Vivian Ryan, who I'm proud to call Mom. Well, Mary Vivian Ryan wanted a little girl. She thought about and dreamed about this little girl from a young age. But when she got married, she named that child April, her oldest, a child that she had dreamed about years before. So April is my name. I am the lineage and the legacy from Joseph Dollar Brown. But my story is a story about my family, myself, and in ways we're similar to other African Americans in this nation, other African American families. But there is also a unique story to be told. My mother, Mary Vivian Ryan, she attended the 1963 March on Washington. And I was born in 1967, just months before Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. As a child, I knew America had started to improve with Black people, but I was seeing a better day than my mother did. My mother lived in Baltimore in her young adult years when she was married and had 2 children. But early on, she was not able to try on clothes in Baltimore shops because of Jim Crow laws. But we still had a long way to go. The first time I realized this, that things were changing, it was because I was at my grandparents' house in North Carolina. My grandparents' house in the southeastern tip of North Carolina. And I found something that I'd never seen before. I was with my family on a Sunday afternoon, a typical Sunday afternoon after church, but many Southern families do. They gather together, about 20 or so people after dinner. And we were under the carport, just regaling about life, laughter, and even the dinner that we just had. Well, a pickup truck filled with about 10 or 15 white men drove down the end of the cul-de-sac. Now, mind you, I was about 9 years old in the late 70s at that time, and I remember it like it was yesterday. And what happened would never leave my mind. These men turned around, made a U-turn, coming back to our family home. And one of the men, clad in overalls, raised a rifle, pointed it at my family. Well, that moment has forever changed my life. That moment I will never forget. I was unnerved and immediately knew that racism was real, and it was Black versus white. But I had never experienced something like this in Baltimore. Again, it left a mark on me forever. Well, my parents wanted to invest in me. They wanted to make sure that I didn't feel the sting of racism. They invested in my education, sending me to private school to avoid busing, forced desegregation that my mother felt would put me at risk of taunting, hurt, racism, and so much more. Now, mind you, I grew up Baptist. I was a Baptist child, but I attended a Catholic school. She wanted me there to keep me safe, to get a good education. But this also prepared me for my HBCU experience at Morgan State University in Baltimore, where I studied broadcast journalism. Oh, I was hungry to be in the business that I worked so hard for. I wanted to be in the industry and be part of it. I could breathe it, I could taste it. I wanted to be a part of it. But I always would feed stories to the National Black Network, American Urban Radio Networks, and I would get paid for those stories. Those stories were on issues of race. Those stories elevated me to the White House, to be a White House correspondent in 1997. Oh, when I first started, it was very, very intimidating. I had to calm my nerves, viewing it as a larger version of City Hall. Well, I remember my first week. It went like this. My questions raised eyebrows, as people thought I was militant because I asked questions about issues of an underserved community, the Black community, a community that didn't always get answers. I would ask about slavery, slavery apology, reparations, the Black church burnings, as well as the payments for Black farmers who were discriminated against by the USDA, and so much more. Yes, I asked questions about an America that did not get as much attention as other communities, even as race was on the president's table, well, the resolute desk, if you will. The mainstream media, the people I watched on TV and admired, viewed me as a militant, believe that or not. But those issues were never on the press briefing agenda until a crescendo moment at the White House, until they realized that I was asking questions about a community that was underserved, and I didn't have an agenda. My colleagues gave me no eye contact for a while and did not embrace me into the most esteemed fold in journalism. But about 20 years later, that changed. I think of my friend, TV host Joy Reid, who says I made race an issue that's now in vogue at the White House. That's interesting to hear that. But nonetheless, at the time, people were worried about me asking questions about a community that's underserved. But race does play when it comes to the White House. How does it play? The president has it on his table. But once again, it has become vogue. But I think back to a time when the tide shifted, when people recognized I was asking questions because it was pertinent. It was about an underserved community. I think about Hurricane Katrina, when then President George W. Bush would call on me before I even raised my hand, understanding that I was asking about a community that was hurting. And I think about the years prior to that, when former White House Press Secretary Mike McCurry, who was the press secretary under then President Bill Clinton, would tell his staff, take April's questions seriously. That juxtaposed to what happened in the last couple of years. So I've been working at the White House for more than 20 years when the Trump administration arrived. I had moved to the esteemed third row, smack dab in the middle, a mark of my seniority a few years prior to their attempts to, I guess you would say, put me in my place, if you will. And this administration made its sentiments more than clear. Former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer taunted me, telling me to stop shaking my head when I was in disbelief from an answer that he gave. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, former White House Press Secretary, said my questions were ridiculous, among other things, and lied on me and about me, as Fox News made me their poster child for targets of hate that continue until this day. Well, with all this hate towards me, I had to begin to protect myself from taunts, death, and bomb threats towards me and my family. It's a sad day when a reporter in the United States has to have a bodyguard to protect her because she asks questions, probing questions that are protected by the First Amendment. Well, people came to the White House and lined that black fence, waiting for me to leave my place of work to intimidate me. They stood near the fence. There was a white woman and a group of white people who would stop and look at me. I would walk, then stop again and turned around, and she would look at me, intentionally catching my eye, each time shaking her head in disapproval. I felt personally threatened and was scared. Well, there was a second time this happened. A colleague saw it, and not long after, my company hired security to be with me when I walked to and from the White House. It wasn't just about me. I had to think about my family with this residue of hate. I had to move my family because people were coming to my home as well. I bought a new house in a neighborhood of solitude and seclusion. No matter your moves for safety, your head is always on a swivel to make sure you and your children are okay. People sent letters to my job, to my home. I wasn't safe. I wasn't safe. They wanted to scare me. I just couldn't take the chance that the threats were just an attempt to scare me and be intimidation. I had to view them as warnings of something possibly serious, something possibly to come. But with that said, remember those names I said at the beginning of the story? Joseph Dollar Brown, Ida Brown Smith, Etta Viola Gowans, and Vivian Ryan. They faced racism, they faced torment, they faced hostility and death threats. And this is something that happens to Black Americans. This is remarkable only to those lucky enough not to experience it. And just as they stayed where they were, as they built good lives, as they persevered, I stand on their shoulders and I go to work undaunted. For them and my two daughters, I have to be an example. Undaunted. But because that's what we do. We go to work, we seek the truth, we report it, and we believe that when the truth of our collective humanity is felt and told, change for a colorblind society happens, and racism is no more. It's not a fantasy. Knowing our strength and resolve, it will happen. Change will come. Thank you.
April, thank you so much for introducing us to your family, and the men and women who brought you to this moment. We're also thankful for your vulnerability and for the trust that you placed in us to receive this story. As a fellow journalist, I'd also like to salute you personally for your courage in speaking truth to power every day.
Thank you. Thank you, myself. Thank you.
Megan, how'd you like to introduce our next storyteller?
Thanks, Faisal. We are lucky to have with us Judy Richardson, who brought us the film Eyes on the Prize, which Derek Johnson, as you guys heard, talked about earlier. Judy, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Megan. And yes, I'm so grateful to Derek for mentioning the 14 hours of Eyes on the Prize. It's great. But now my story. It was July 26, 1964, and I was in Greenwood, Mississippi during the historic 1964 Freedom Summer. And at that point, 3 voter registration workers, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman, were missing. Now, of course, we in the movement knew they were dead, probably killed by white policemen and other white supremacists. I mean, the murders of Black Mississippi movement leaders like Medgar Evers and Herbert Lee, and so many others throughout the South, were well known. So I was on the staff of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, usually called SNCC, the organization formed by young sit-in leaders like Diane Nash and Julian Bond and John Lewis, who was then SNCC's chair. So SNCC was the Southern movement's only national organization led by young people. I was 20 years old and from Tarrytown, New York. That day in 1964 started out as usual. I walked from the place that would be my home that summer, the small house of a struggling family who'd been brave enough to offer a bed in their 2-room home to movement workers. And I headed to the SNCC office. I didn't know the day would end with my escape from a white mob. I was one of those who worked the 800 phone line that kept us in touch with all of our SNCC projects in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, and Arkansas, checking on any church burnings or arrests or beatings of voter registration workers, or others who might have been killed or beaten by white folks just at random to try to keep Black people in line. So I and others would call our project staff twice a day and carefully take down the information they gave us. Then I called the local FBI office in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, back then, the FBI agents, all of them in the South, were all white men. And they were often former Southern law officers who'd gotten a lucky promotion to be FBI staff. And they all made clear when we called that they really couldn't care less about the violence we were reporting. And no wonder, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had tried in so many ways to destroy the movement. In fact, he publicly said that those 3 particular missing civil rights workers were probably just hiding, as he said, quote, to inflame the situation, unquote. So I, young Judy Richardson, who had grown up thinking that, Mr. Policeman is my friend, had to force these hostile white FBI agents to take down the details of a church burning or a shooting, changing to a voice that said, "You will listen to me." So now, on that July night in 1964, I was working in our office in the Black section of Greenwood, Mississippi, when June Johnson rushes in to say I have to drive her and 2 other local Black teenagers to Greenwood Segregated Hospital. She says, "We got to go now. We got to go now to the hospital. Jake and Silas McGee, they went to the movies again," just to know the theater had just been integrated. "And when they came out, there was a big mob of white folks, and someone threw a rock through the car window and glass flew into Silas's eye. We got to go." So says June. Now, just to know, Silas, then 21 years old, and his older brother, Jake, did everything together, including working in the movement. And after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, they especially wanted to go to the white movie theater to enjoy the films that showed there, just like everyone else. Well, no, but they kept trying. And just about a word about June Johnson, too. She came from a strong movement family in Greenwood. The year before, at age 15, June had been badly beaten in a Winona, Mississippi jail, along with the legendary Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer and 3 other movement workers, just for sitting on the white side of an interstate bus station. But that sure hadn't stopped June, because here she was, saying I needed to drive them in the SNCC car to the hospital. So we run to the car, and I drive at the speed limit, as I had been taught to do, so we wouldn't be arrested on some bogus speeding charge. Then a white couple pulls alongside us, and I look over at them, and I see the same hate-filled expressions we saw on the faces of most white Southerners who thought that this movement and certainly those trying to equalize power through the vote were the enemy. Then they pulled back. That's when we hear a bang. And June says, "Judy, hurry up, they're shooting at us." And I say, no, June, that's just a backfire. Now, she looked at me like I was crazy. I mean, she was from Greenwood and I was from Tarrytown, New York, and knew nothing. But I do speed up. And finally, we pull into the small outdoor parking lot in front of the hospital's front door. But there's a large mob of white folks with guns and baseball bats. So we jump out of the car and hightail it into the hospital. June immediately runs to see about the McGees. I stay in the waiting room and begin to make calls. Now remember, this is before cell phones. So I'm pumping dimes into the public coin phone. Also, as soon as I arrive at the hospital, I notice 6 FBI agents sitting in the reception area, looking uncomfortable, but doing nothing, as usual. But there had been a change that summer. Unlike the national reaction after all those other Southern Black folks had been killed or beaten when they tried to vote, this time was different, because 2 of the 3 missing civil rights workers were white Northerners. So the FBI was forced to pay a bit more attention. Besides, this was 1964, Freedom Summer. So over 1,000 primarily white college students had joined this campaign, organized by local movement leaders, along with SNCC and CORE, and under the umbrella of COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. And the object couldn't have been more basic: to register Black Mississippi voters without getting them killed. And all those white students had brought with them political pressure from towns and cities across the country. And most important, they brought the national media to Mississippi. So I began calling on the public phone in the hospital's reception room, to our Atlanta SNCC office and our Friends of SNCC network around the country. But most important, I called the wonderful John Doerr at the Justice Department. Now, clearly, this is not William Barr's Justice Department, right? But I had to leave messages because John Doerr wasn't in. Then suddenly a rock comes flying through the picture window in the reception area. And I had never seen FBI agents run so quickly. I mean, they ran behind the wall of the hallway that led to the rest of the hospital. And I knew that FBI agents never did anything but take notes, even when a federal law was being broken. And still I got enraged. I started yelling at them, all 6 agents now sitting on the floor of the hallway. "Why don't you do something? You're the FBI." And they looked at me like I was a crazy lady. So I keep peeking around the wall, and when I think the mob has moved away from the reception window, I go back to calling the Justice Department. Finally, June returns to say the doctors have been able to take the glass out of Silas's eye, and it appears that his eyesight won't be harmed. She also says that his mother is with him, as is his older brother, Clarence. There were 3 sons. Now, once I heard that, I knew it was okay for me to leave. I mean, Clarence was a U.S. paratrooper on furlough who did not play. And their mother, Mrs. Laura McGee, was fierce. Their family owned a farm, which they allowed the movement to use for rallies and to secure bail money for jailed movement workers. Plus, Mrs. McGee was clear on the issue of self-defense. She guarded their house with a Winchester rifle, and a Mississippi policeman once shoved her to the ground with his nightstick during a demonstration. She got up, then grabbed the officer's nightstick and pushed him down. Other demonstrators had to pull her off him. And this was not the only incident like that. So it's okay for us to leave, but how do we get through the white mob that's still in the outdoor parking lot? Now, there are 2 endings to this story. Ending number 1, and the one I told for years during my talks. It was, I and other movement workers had called so many people that by that time, 3 legendary SNCC organizers were waiting to escort us, minus June, back to the SNCC office. James Foreman, our larger-than-life executive secretary, and 2 Mississippi SNCC project directors, Stokely Carmichael, who becomes Kwame Ture, and Ivanhoe Donaldson. Now fast forward to ending number 2. It's 1988, and the film Mississippi Burning has just premiered in movie theaters. I'm sitting with June Johnson and other SNCC workers at the ABC TV studio for the news magazine 2020. We're in the green room where guests hang out till the show begins, and we're about to tape a segment where we SNCC folk discuss the film. As some of you know, Mississippi Burning is a fictionalized account of the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the three movement workers whom I mentioned earlier and whose bodies were finally found in an earthen dam several weeks after their disappearance. A deputy sheriff and others were found guilty of their murder, but didn't serve much time, if any at all. Not much has changed here. The film got an Academy Award nomination, but civil rights workers strongly condemned it. I mean, there's no mention in the film of the Black Mississippi movement. And in the film, FBI agents are portrayed as the heroes, not the enemies of the movement that they actually were. So, a lot of us were really angry. Now, here we are, we're waiting in the green room, and I say to June, you remember when we were surrounded in that hospital and we got rescued by Foreman and Stokely and Ivanhoe? And she says, no, we weren't. She says, don't you remember? You kept peeking around that wall so you could go back to making calls to John Doerr. And finally, you or someone got through to the Justice Department, and then you forced the sheriff to escort you back to the SNCC office. You said you wouldn't leave unless he did. And I said, oh my gosh, I've been telling it wrong all these years. Now, sometime later, movement scholar Dr. Emily Crosby sent me a copy of my deposition from that time. Later, I read an account of the incident in a seminal book on the Mississippi movement, Local People, by John Dittmer. There's another also wonderful one by Charles Payne, I Got the Light of Freedom. But both John and Emily confirmed that I refused to leave until the sheriff agreed, much against his will, to escort me and the others in my car back to the SNCC office. Okay, so what happened to the McGee family? They continued being a bulwark of the Greenwood, Mississippi movement, even though white vigilantes shot into, firebombed, and eventually burned their house to the ground. And Silas? The next year, in 1965, he was shot and almost died when a white man, they suspected a white policeman who'd been harassing him, shot him point blank in the head. The bullet entered just below his temple and lodged in his throat. They rushed him to University Hospital in Jackson. They got the bullet out, and he survived, and he continued working in the movement. He also became the youngest member of SNCC's executive committee. It was folks like these, the Johnsons and the McGees and the Dewey Greens family, who organized and sustained the movement for voting rights and economic justice. And a lot of them are on our SNCC digital website, sncdigital.org, get the plugin. It's a collaboration that we have with Duke University. And now other strong organizers are continuing that fight for justice and to preserve our democracy. Let me end more personally. More personally, that experience and just being in the movement, surrounded by amazingly brilliant and courageous people, brought out in me a strength I didn't even know I had. And it's a strength I've carried with me the rest of my life, still supported by SNCC's band of brothers and sisters in a circle of trust. And thank you for listening.
Judy, thank you so much for your detailed and vivid memories and for your ongoing work to make sure the history of the civil rights movement is not forgotten. Your willingness to share your story and to tell those of others are a gift to all of us.
Thank you.
And now let's welcome Joan Trumphauer Mulholland, whose work with the Freedom Riders was forged by her childhood memories spending summers in the Deep South.
Well, as a child growing up in the South, I never gave segregation a thought until when I was about 10 and down visiting Grandma in Oconee, Georgia, an old company logging town, not that fancy resort. My playmate sort of dared me to go with her and walk through the colored section. Now, that's not the word we used, but colored was a polite term back then. Black was rude, but you know what we used. Well, it was a little strange, but when we got to the colored school, that did it for me. It was a shack, never been painted. Front door was ajar. You could see the pot-bellied stove for heat, no electricity, no running water, no glass or screens in the windows, just wooden shutters, no playground equipment, no grass in the schoolyard, and only one outhouse. And I knew out the other end of town was the fanciest building for miles around, a brand new post-World War II brick school for the white kids. And I knew this was not fair. This was not treating other people the way we wanted to be treated, like we learned in Sunday school. And I sort of resolved that when I could do something to make the South the best it could be for everybody there, I would seize the moment. Well, that moment came when I was a freshman at Duke University in 1960, and the freedom and the sit-ins started. And some of the students who were doing the demonstrations over at North Carolina College came over to a sort of semi-secret meeting at Duke and explained to us in legal and moral terms about the demonstrations. And then, lo and behold, they invited us to join them. So a handful of us did join them on the picket line, and then at the lunch counters, and then in the jail. I was arrested twice at the lunch counters. Well, Duke was not happy, and I finished my semester, got my credit hours, and split for Washington, D.C. Now, the North Carolina College students asked me to go up to Howard University and find out what was happening. They hadn't heard anything. You know, this was back before interstate. I mean, it's getting late. My tongue is twisting around. This was back before email. And so I went up to Howard, and a group of students were planning to sit in a few days in Arlington. Well, since I was from Arlington, you know, across the river from DC, and I had a little experience in sit-ins and such, they asked me to join them. So I became part of the Howard group. And we caused what John Lewis would call good trouble that summer all over the DC area. Well, 61 was the year of the Freedom Rides. Now, a little bit of a backstory on that. Mama Boynton had been working on voting education and trying to register for years down in Selma. And her son, Bruce, was a law student at Howard University. He'd bought a bus ticket to go home and visit Mama. Got off in Richmond, Virginia, went in to the station to get a bite to eat. He went in the wrong waiting room, got himself arrested, and that case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. The decision came down in December of 1960 that all facilities in the interstate travel realm had to be open to everybody equally. So the Freedom Rides got going by CORE to test compliance with the Supreme Court ruling. Well, things went, you know, not too bad most of the way until they got to Alabama. That's where one of the buses, there were two bus lines in, Greyhound and Trailways. One bus was firebombed just outside of Anniston, Alabama. And there's that picture of Hank Thomas standing outside the bus. Hank was part of our DC sit-in group. And the other bus, the Freedom Riders, were attacked when they got off the bus. So beaten so badly, things could not continue. So following the teachings of Gandhi, if one person cannot continue, somebody else has to step up to take their place. So the students who had been sitting in across the South came and kept the Freedom Rides going. It became fill the jails to force the Kennedys to follow the Supreme Court ruling. Well, I was with a group that flew from Washington, D.C. down to New Orleans. And Stokely Carmichael was part of that group. So since I'd recruited him, I claim credit for taking Stokely to the Deep South and all that followed. My man. Well, we took the train, the Illinois Central, from New Orleans and got off in Jackson, went into the waiting room, sat down, and promptly got arrested, put in the paddy wagon and taken to the city jail. Now, when I went to step down out of the paddy wagon, the police officer reached out to take my arm to help me down. And that gave me faith that in the end, things were going to work out okay. So it was on to the city jail, to our trial, which was just pro forma, then over to the county jail. Of course, the jails were segregated, and here I was in this cell with all these white Yankee girls who had come south because they did not approve of or like white Southerners. And I'm the only white Southerner in that cell. They couldn't sing. They sounded like they were singing Union songs, not church songs. And they didn't know what grits and collard greens were. Well, it got so crowded in that cell that we had less than 3 square feet of floor space per prisoner. And one girl slept curled up in the shower. They had to do something. They decided to take us up to Parchman State Prison Farm, the most dreaded prison in the entire United States. They took the prisoners on death row and put them someplace nicer in the prison and put the Freedom Riders on death row. Well, they were trying to frighten us, and I was on to them because I'm a Southerner. I knew what they were up to. And in reality, it was roomier and cleaner, and the food was way better than in that old county jail. Now, when some of the guys got out of jail, they stayed in Mississippi. Some of these guys who had been sitting in and then became Freedom Riders, they stayed to work in the communities and try to help people figure out what they could do to improve things. And they figured pretty fast that you got to be able to elect the people who make and enforce the laws. So voter registration became the big emphasis. And some of them, including my buddy Stokely, they moved on over into Alabama in a year or so, around Selma. And that led to the march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we know how that went. Well, Mama Boynton was beaten severely and unconscious. Later, Congressman John Lewis, I think he had his skull cracked, but he definitely had a concussion. And it was so awful that President Lyndon Johnson, a Southern Democrat, went on national TV, back when that was big, before a joint session of Congress and talked about the beating of Mama Boynton and said we must have a voting rights law and we shall overcome. Those 3 words, we shall overcome, was the death knell of the Southern Democratic Party that had propelled him to the presidency. And he knew it when he said it. Okay, we got the Voting Rights Act. We got the federal registrars, the first elected Black governor in the entire history of the United States, Doug Wilder, who served in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. And we got President Obama. Well, on the 50th anniversary of the March on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, there's Mama Boynton sitting in a wheelchair, almost 100 years old. And on either sides of her are President Obama and Congressman John Lewis. We had come that far. Well, now, I didn't go out and work in the field because a white girl working in the field back then, that was forbidden because we would endanger everybody else just by our presence. I had already been accepted at Tougaloo College, so I went on out to campus a little bit before, our former speaker. And I had to study hard. I did indeed. And in 63, that was the most important year. And you ask most people, what do you remember about 1963 and the Civil Rights Movement? Oh, it's the March on Washington, a wonderful day. Well, that's just a small part of the story. They had been the dogs and the fire hoses on the kids in Birmingham. Less than a month later, we had our Jackson Woolworth sit-in, where I had all this sugar dumped on my head like I wasn't sweet enough. That was the most violent reaction to a sit-in. It's the most used sit-in picture in the country. And it was the most integrated sit-in. Ann Moody, who's black, me's white. And in that picture, you got Professor John Salter, who's Native American. That was something to do. But then we got out of there alive, though it had been a little iffy. Emotionally, I had just shut down. It was like an out-of-body experience. And I hear that happens to soldiers in combat. But we did make it out. And then just a couple weeks later, Medgar Evers was shot to death in his driveway with an armload of T-shirts that said, "Jim Crow must go." Then we got to the March on Washington. That was good. I had spent most of the summer working in the DC's March on Washington office and spent that day working in the press tent up on the monument grounds. Wonderful. But then about 2 weeks later, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed in Birmingham, and those 4 little girls were killed. A bunch of us went over from Tougaloo College for the funeral of 3 of them. And we stopped at the church and picked up a bunch of shards of glass, of the stained glass that had come out of the windows. Most of mine is now on exhibit down at the Smithsonian's African American Museum. And to round out the year, President Kennedy was assassinated in November. Okay, bad year. 64, I graduated, moved back up to Washington, D.C. area, married, raised 5 sons. That was a challenge. But they made it. I made it through. In 2009, I went to Obama's inauguration with another person who had been involved in the Jackson sit-in. But first we went to Medgar Evers' grave in Arlington National Cemetery, sort of to virtually report to him what had happened, to give thanks for him and the other people who had died getting us the right to vote. That was sad, but happy too that we now had the fruit of our labors with President Obama. We walked across the bridge, across the river, as we say around here, and took in the inauguration. 2015, just to update things, Australia had copied our freedom rides. They did it for Aboriginal rights, same discrimination over there pretty much. And they were having the 50th anniversary of the Australian freedom rides. That's where I got my shirt. That's not from the US freedom rides, that's from the Australian freedom rides. And I took my 15-year-old granddaughter with me. Her teachers figured she'd learn more going on this adventure to Australia than she would learn if she stayed in school. And I think she did. Well, I'm not marching anymore. My knees have worn out. But I travel all over the country to speak. Well, now I'm zooming around the country to speak. And I tell what we did back in the day, because those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And I encourage folks to carry things forward. My generation took care of legal segregation, but we still have lots of discrimination out there. And folks need to keep moving forward and take care of the problems. because Black lives do matter, and we shall overcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. I appreciate your depth of memory, your lifetime of work on the front lines, and it is such a blessing to hear from you. And we appreciate you calling us to carry on your work. We know you have put in the time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Amen. I would like to bring up my co-MC, Mizell, to say a few words.
Let me thank all of our storytellers for bringing so much heart and passion to tonight's virtual gathering. The work of SNCC and the Freedom Riders are deeply personal to me, as I spent summers as a child visiting my family in Anniston, Alabama, where a Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders was attacked and burned in 1961. News coverage of the civil rights movement changed the course of history and fueled my own desire to become a journalist. I am just one of many who are personally indebted to those who fought against segregation and for equal opportunity. And as the stories of Ashley, Derek, and April revealed, it is a fight that continues today.
I would like to thank Mizell. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And he and I would like to thank all of our storytellers. We're going to bring them up now so that you can give them thanks in your own homes. Judy, Ashley, Joan, April, and Derek, who can't be with us. Thank you so much for investing in this evening.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been great.
It has been great.
And I hope somebody out there gets an idea they can carry forward.
I do too, Joan.
It's over.
Absolutely, Joan.
Amen. Thank you, Joan. To our viewers, I'm just going to say thank you for watching. We appreciate. That's it. Thank you much.